Dr. Coleman?
Present.
I want to hear
Okay,
Ms.
I can
Lang.
hear now. I can hear
Perfect, thank
now.
Perfect.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, good. At this time, may I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Madam Chair, Madam President, I so move.
It's been moved by Ms. Morrow and second by Ms. Williams to approve tonight's agenda. And we'll move to our items for discussion. The demographic study, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Our first item up for discussion is our demographic study. During the 23-24 school year, our previous superintendent and the board agreed to do a demographic study of Riverview Gardens. We have gentlemen here that will share information related to that study. So I will hand this over to Carl Scheid. He is our Executive Director of Facilities. Mr. Scheid?
Thank you. With us tonight, we have Steve Raskin and Christopher Dick. They will cover the information that's been provided to you and summarize the demographic study. I will turn it over to them now.
All right, thank you, Carl. As we're getting that pulled up, I will get this all set up. My name is Chris Dick. My company is Demographic Analytics Advisors. We do a ton of work in K-12 enrollment studies, as well as GIS map drawing. A little bit of my background before we hop in. I actually started my career at the Census Bureau running the population forecasting area for the United States. And then worked at a few other companies before I started this company doing this type of forecasting. But today we're going to talk about your school district, Riverview Gardens School District, and our demographic study really focused on the enrollment forecast here today, and then give some time for questions. So let's start with an outline. We're going to start today with a little bit about our background and goals, some of the things that we take into consideration in all forecasts, as well as things that are specific to you all. It's a touchy trigger here. Oh, there we go. What we took into consideration, some historic enrollment trends for your district, our births, both actual and forecast, and the methodology we use both to forecast births as well as to forecast enrollment, and then the actual forecast. So a little bit about our background and goals here. The goals of this process were to develop a reasonable enrollment forecast that takes into account a few different things. Development, migration, and we're talking here about either migration in or out of the district. Any impacts we had from COVID-19, we know districts throughout the country had some decreases and then some rebounds. We don't want to over forecast the impacts from COVID. We also want to look at the impact of market share. Have things been changing either with charter schools or private schools or folks moving out, and historical enrollment patterns. We also want to measure this against the capacity of each of these schools. So I want to talk a little bit about what an enrollment forecast is and what it isn't. So what is it? It's a scientific most likely scenario based on all the inputs. It basically tells us, given everything we know today, this is what we think is going to happen over the next 10 years. It's an extremely useful planning tool if it is used correctly and questioned. What isn't it? It is not a magic solution that's going to tell us to a student exactly what your enrollment is going to be in 10 years. But it is also not a random and wild guess at what enrollment will be in 10 years. There's a lot of science and data backing this. So what are some of the things that we take into consideration when we're building these forecasts? We have things, historical enrollment patterns are obviously incredibly important. We need to understand your school capacity as well as your attendance zones, those geographic bounds from which your students are drawn. We need to understand demographic processes. And as a few of us were talking before this presentation here, I could nerd out all day about births, migration, all of that. I won't bore you too much. We'll just talk about it a little. We also need to talk about the built environment, things like building permits, known development areas, economics, and then, as we noted before, the impacts of COVID. So what is our methodology? Much like, the really baseline way that you do a lot of enrollment forecasting is something called a grade progression ratio based forecast. And really what we're looking at is historical enrollment data as well as how many students are moving from grade to grade year over year. It's as simple as that. I mean, there's a lot of complicated math behind it, but the actual idea is very, very simple and very strong. Then we need to look at a couple different impacts. We need to look at any impacts of new builds and the student yield thereof. We need to look at any impacts in the change in market share and any impacts of COVID-19 anomalies. So one of the first things that we had to do when we started this process was to look at the current school boundaries. Unfortunately, we didn't actually have something that we in the GIS field call a shapefile to do this. So we actually took the address listing file for the district and drew this file. That's what you're seeing here for the elementary schools, the middle schools, and then obviously didn't show the high school. There's just one of them. So that was our first step. Our next step is to look at current population trends. So the US Census Bureau develops school district population estimates, both total population and school age population on a yearly basis. They're called the small area income and poverty estimates. The most recent estimate released in 2023 is for the July 1st of 2022. And it gives us a good baseline of what kind of to expect historically from the district. A couple things that you'll notice here. Right at 2020, we have this big kind of drop down. This is due to the Census Bureau's methodology. Basically, they have a decennial census every 10 years, and then they create estimates in the interim years that don't end in zero. So when the census came in 2020, basically the total for your school district for school-age children was a little lower than they had expected from the prior decade. So that's why you have that big bump down. It's not like you guys lost students all in 1 year. It was probably a more gradual process from 2010 moving forward to 2020. Our expectation from this historical data is that we're going to have relatively stable and a slowly declining school-age population within your district. Well, where do those students come from? They either have to come from births that are happening within your district, or they have to come from people moving in, right? So the first thing we want to look at is students who are born in the district and stay here. So what we do is we like to look at something called the birth to kindergarten ratio. Basically what we're doing, we're looking at students who are born to mothers who are resident within the school district, who 5 years later are then in kindergarten. We're not actually following individual people. We're looking at aggregate data here. We're just looking at the numbers of births and the number of kindergartners. But the general idea is a ratio of 1 would mean that all of the students or all of the children who were born here ended up going to school here in aggregate. Obviously, you could have people moving in and out, but it's coming out in a wash. If you have a ratio over 1, that means you have students moving in. You have more kindergartners than you have births. If you have a number under 1, it means you have students moving out. You have children being born to resident mothers who are then not enrolling in the public schools here. And that could either be because they're moving out or because they're making different choices about where to send their children to school. Our key finding here is that your school district has generally seen a declining birth to kindergarten ratio over the past about 15 years. We forecast this to stay relatively stable. I know there's some jaggedness when you're looking at this here. A lot of those are some COVID impacts. I definitely can tell you that from a lot of our experience. So our best model here is really telling us that we're going to stay kind of right at that 0.8 number over the next 10 years, which means we are having less children than attend kindergarten than were born 5 years earlier in your district. So what are those births going to look like? Well, births have been declining in the district, as well as in the county overall, as well as in the country overall, for quite a while now, at least since the early 1990s. If you look again throughout the country, just to provide more context, we were seeing some increases in births going into about 2008. Basically, a lot of the younger millennials were starting to have children. That's a very large cohort of people. And we were seeing births increase. Well, then what happened in 2008? We had an economic crisis. Those births and birth rates fell off the table. In some places, they started to rebound right around the middle of the 2010s. In other places, they did not. Really what we're seeing in your district and in the county overall is decline kind of basically monotonically. It's a straight line kind of over the last 20 to 30 years at least. The COVID-19 era led to a decrease in births with no recovery that we've seen within your district. This is different in some places. We did actually see a dip and then a boom in some places, But overall, again, just to provide a larger geographic context, the United States in 2023, the most recent data that we have, had the lowest fertility rate ever in our country in 2023. So this is happening everywhere. Our expectation here is that births should continue to slowly decrease throughout this forecast period. So if births are one part of this, the other part is, okay, what does your historic enrollment look like? What this table shows us right here is basically since the 2014-15 school year through current, what our by grade as well as K-12 total enrollment is for Riverview Gardens School District. And one of the things you'll note is generally the enrollment has been down over time, but has been, it's gone up and down depending on the year. That is a very normal pattern to see. You have a large class than a small class. So this is a very important data because it then really informs our forecasting process. So to build our forecast, we use something called grade progression ratios. Grade progression ratios are really the staple of K-12 enrollment forecasts. They allow us to understand historical patterns and who stays or who leaves in a school district as they progress through the grades. Much like the kindergarten, the birth to kindergarten ratio, we are looking at a ratio again. But this time, instead of looking births to 5 years later, kindergarten, we're looking at kindergartners in year 1 versus first graders in year 2. First graders to second graders, so on and so forth. Really, again, we're looking at the same process here. A number of right around 1 tells us that once students are in a particular grade, the enrollment is relatively stable moving forward. Number below 1 means you have students moving out. Above 1 means you have students moving in. Riverview Gardens grade progression ratios are generally near or just under 1 for 1st through 8th grade, which is a pretty common thing to see. For high school grades, they're generally just under 1. So we can look at these kind of one by one. Again, I want to get to the question and answer part of this. I know you all have had a chance to look at some of these slides, so we won't belabor these too much. But I do kind of just want to show 1st through 4th grade here. Again, we're forecasting numbers right around 1. So basically, once we have those kindergartners, we're saying from kindergarten all the way through 4th grade, we're expecting that number to stay relatively stable. You see similar things for 5th through 8th grade. And then we do see some of these numbers slightly below 1 for 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. Again, this is something that we see in a lot of school districts. So what does it all mean for the actual district-wide forecast? Well, the trend of district enrollment over the past 15 years has been slightly down for Riverview Gardens. That being said, some years see larger decreases with increases in the following years, as we saw in the table. Our expectation, kind of given our modeling, given looking at your development context, the economics, kind of all of the pieces of this, is that enrollment will continue to decrease over the next decade, finishing the forecast period, so that 2034-35 school year, just below 4,500 students, not including pre-kindergarten. Often we forecast pre-kindergarten very differently than we do kindergarten. If we want to look at the actual grade by grade piece of this, that's what this table shows us. Starting again, 24-25 is actual data. And then moving forward all the way through 2035-36, we see decreases in some years, larger decreases, some years lower. Again, that's based on the birth cohorts and how large they are. So let's start kind of breaking this down by different levels, as well as different geographic areas. If we want to look at preschool enrollment, this is, again, I note that we do this in a very different way. Often this is tied to how you decide on the capacity that you have, the number of pre-K students that want to sign up. It's a little different than kindergarten moving forward. But basically, we're assuming a slowly decreasing population for pre-kindergarten moving throughout the period, again, given the declining births. If we look at kindergarten through 5th grade, again, we see a slow decrease throughout the period, given what we were looking at earlier. 6th through 8th, we actually see over the next, I'd say 5 years, a relatively flat trajectory before a decrease. This is given where we are currently in elementary school with the number of students that we have versus the number of middle school students we currently have. And then high school, a similar thing. We kind of dip down, come back up, and then start declining again. That's given those kind of grade progression ratios. So the other piece that I want to get to is actually looking school by school. And this is where we start actually comparing to some of the capacity numbers that we have. On these slides, we were able, which I'm sorry I neglected to say here, we actually have a red dotted line here, which is, for elementary school is, about 4,500. That is the capacity for all of your elementary schools added together throughout the district. So this is telling us, we are below capacity for elementary schools. For middle schools, that number is much closer to actual enrollment, though the enrollment, at least over the last about 5 years, has been a bit lower. And for high schools, similarly, we are lower than the actual capacity. So we want to look at that actually for elementary schools. And the first thing, I know this is a little hard to look at. You all have, I know you guys have the printouts here. But the important piece of this, as I'm usually looking at, if I'm looking at a school district that has a declining enrollment, is I want to look at when we start hitting a couple benchmarks for capacity. And those benchmarks, I usually like to start flagging if we're below 90% in a declining school district. That's where I usually tag things as yellow, kind of on the stop sign idea. And anything below 80% is where we start saying, okay, this is more, we want to highlight these as red. So as you can see here, I know it's kind of going off the slide from where I'm looking at. We have the total at the top. We can see here in 2015, the enrollment over capacity was about 67%. We're forecasting by the end of the forecast period that that'll be just under 50% for elementary school enrollments. And you can see here kind of school by school, you have Danforth and Gibson are a little bit higher, whereas some other schools are a bit lower. I also have this for different years for an actual map of this. So this is the 2019-2020 elementary school utilization, looking at the actual attendance zones, again, color coded for each of these. And the interesting thing here is to look how things change over time. So we can look, we start here with, Danforth and Gibson, both near 100%. In 2024, we're looking at Danforth at about 86%, Gibson 76%. And each of these are kind of decreasing over time. By 2030, this is what the map looks like. Mm-hmm. And by 2035, 36, this is kind of what we're looking at. So that's our elementary schools. I also have charts for each and every one of the schools, so you can look at the actual totals over time. I'm not going to go through each one of these today. We can go back to them in the question and answer if it's useful, but I just did want to have them as a useful piece of this for you all as you're looking through here. So we can kind of look through each of the elementary schools very quickly here. Lewis and Clark, Meadows, Moline, and then we get to the middle schools. Same setup here for the middle schools. We again start with the total and then move to each of the middle schools, looking again at utilization. Same rules, under 90% and then under 80% for the different colors. And here we can see again, we're decreasing, but we are much closer to overall capacity. Our utilization is higher in our middle schools. And you can see this again in chart form with the actual enrollment numbers instead of percentages here. And then your forecast for your high school. Again, the utilization here has actually increased a bit. And then we're forecasting it to slowly decrease over the next 10 years. However, still in the 65 down to like the 60% range. And that's the piece. So that is the end of the presentation for now, and move to questions.
Can you give more details on the utilization? Are you saying that the capacity, we're not using the capacity of the building?
So when I'm saying utilization is a strict numeric calculation
Okay.
of your stated capacity,
Mhm.
which was given to me by the district, as the denominator and enrollment as the numerator, right? So it is not saying, you're exactly using this much of your actual physical space in a building. It is more saying your stated capacity is at this level. And you're using this percentage of that stated capacity.
Got you.
Yep.
Okay.
So.
Uh, And I don't know if you can answer this for me, you probably can, but where do you see when you were figuring this up, what do you see the largest migration out of the district? Which buildings do you see that at?
The largest migration out of buildings, well, you can see it a bit in the different enrollment pieces if we
Okay.
go back to the slides.
Okay.
You can see where we're losing the most students.
Right. Because what I was wondering if of those, the areas where there's a high percentage of vacancies and
Mhm.
homes that have set for quite a long period of time with no improvements made to them or what have you.
Yeah. And that's what I will say, a couple things that we looked at, both building permits as well as things like demolitions, as well as things like vacancy. There's a correlation between those pieces, though I think you would still have to even go back even further than we were looking at to see the true correlation
Right.
of that. And then it gets a little hard to actually get vacancy data going back that far. But yeah, I mean, you can see here in the elementary schools, you can see kind of the different patterns that we have in each of the schools. Of course, this thing is, I gotta like point it just right. So again, we have Danforth here. We've, seen decreases over time, but coming from a higher level of utilization. Gibson actually was increasing for a little while and then decreased. And we've seen the decrease actually started before COVID here. So it's not just a COVID effect. Here we have Glasgow. I'm not sure how you guys pronounce that one. But again, this one's been a kind of steady decline since the early 2010s. Seeing, again, steady decline in Highland, and then you have some weird COVID-ness here in the Highland data. Here, Coke, we have kind of more stable pattern, but we've had some like weird
Right.
kind of, different pieces in different years. Again, stable in the Masters. Lewis and Clark's been slow decline. Meadows has been relatively stable, again, except for a couple years here that were outliers. Moline was going down and is actually stabilized. And so we did see correlations between each of these things. But one of the things that I will say is the strength of a grade progression ratio model is if the things that have been happening historically continue happening in the future, it is a very strong way to predict what is going to happen. If something major changes, COVID happens, that's going to be hard for it to take into account. But in our looking at each of the different kind of pieces of the development puzzle, economics, all of that, this has basically taken all of those pieces into account.
Ms. Real mentioned the vacancies and
Mhm.
homes that were unoccupied, but we've also seen a large influx in the number of homes purchased by investors and that are being sold and leased and what have you. Are you saying that when you took that into consideration, it was kind of evened out?
Yeah, I mean, you're not the only place where that's happening, is what I would say. And it has been happening in a lot of places, in some places for a very long time, right? So there are ways that we incorporate those things into our model. And I would say that, I'm pretty confident that that's taken into account in this.
Well, and also, what about the anticipated developments on 367? Did you factor that?
Yes, I did. Yep. Yeah, so that all of that is taken into account in the model.
So you factored in an anticipated development, bringing economic growth to our community, and you're still saying that.
I think the demographic forces are strong enough that I think I think the decline would have been worse had I not taken it into account, is what I'm saying.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yep. And again, that's over a lot, doing a lot of these and kind of working through the process and then kind of measuring how well we do over time.
So basically you are, according to your predictions, you're predicting that we will lose 800 to 1,000 students within the next 10 years.
Yes. Yep.
Other questions?
Anybody, I have my hand up. Can anybody hear me?
Ms. Lane, I'm sorry, please.
Oh, okay. All right. So I wanted to ask a question. I want to make sure I understood the presenter regarding the utilization, and it, I believe I heard him say that it is below capacity in elementary and high school. Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah, that's correct.
So that means and you visited all of these schools, correct?
So no, these data, the capacity data were given to me by the school district.
Okay, you just got
Yeah, so yeah, the kind of scope
the
of this
numbers. All
exercise
right.
is comparing to the numbers that you all have for capacity. So this is not saying, certain number of, classrooms or any of that. It's working with the district on those numbers.
Because my concern is about the high school, and the high school, just the building, the way that it's designed, it goes back to last century, which a lot of stuff does. But these 9 different buildings that are all a part of the high school, it just is not conducive, in my opinion, to to learning and discipline and a lot of other factors. But if you're saying that it's below capacity, then that means we don't have enough students in the high school building.
Yeah, I mean, I would say
Interpreting you correctly?
given your physical space, that is what those utilization numbers are saying. You have less students than the school physical space could hold.
When you say the
Okay,
physical
thanks.
space, are you counting classrooms or how do you count that?
Yeah. Carl, do you want to speak a little bit to your?
Yes, so, and these capacities have changed over time. There is
Mhm.
some change. Yeah, so we can't look at what our capacities were back when we built, because we have a lot of other things that are in the mix, in terms of what we do in our schools. Thank you. Yeah. So, yes, it was taken into account that, I'm going to use the middle school, for example. The capacities of the middle school, if you notice those, we're closer to full utilization there than we are at the elementary or the high school level. That is because ultimately we've repurposed a lot of the spaces within the middle school, like let's take Central Middle, and outfitted it to serve different programs, different functions, thus taking those classrooms out of typical classroom space. They're more specialized spaces, whether it's computer labs or things like that. So that has been repurposed. At one time, yes, we had 900,000 kids in Central Middle, but today, if we tried to put 900,000 kids in there, we would find it difficult without having to do some major adjustments and renovations. And the same thing is somewhat true with the high school. As space became more available, we had the space and the flexibility to use that space in a different way, to dedicate it to different functions and different things, different support programs. So over the years, we have utilized that space in a different capacity, but in terms of the core educational function, it's not being used in its full capacity. I mean, just another example is, we have, yes, absolutely. Yeah, so if we take the high
Are
school,
you-
for instance, we know we have large sections of Building 7 that are unoccupied by students. We have sections of building 1 that are not occupied by students. So it's not that we're not using the space. We've repurposed the space to support the needs of the students, the needs of our programs, the needs of the district. So, and in these capacity numbers, we did take into account for reasonable class sizes. You know, you could look at some standards that say that you should be able to get 30 or 35 kids in a class. That is very unrealistic in some of our buildings. So for instance, you look at your elementary schools, they're going to be in that, mid-20s in terms of capacity. Could we absolutely cram more people in there? We could, but these were kind of level set based on today's standards and today's practices. So these are not capacities from 50 years ago. I hope that gives a little bit of clarity on the matter.
And so Carl, when you repurpose a space, do you remove that space from this kind of study in terms of saying that, the high school is not using the capacity? Once that, like, for example, building 7, we kind of repurposed part of it. Is that space then deducted from the student space that could be used?
We didn't take it to that level. We looked
Okay.
at the high school as if it is still the high school
Gotcha.
in
Okay.
whole. So in that case, we just know we're underutilizing that space for students at the high school at this time.
Very good. Thank you.
I have another question, please.
She said she had another question.
Yes.
Go
I have
ahead.
another question. Okay, so, did the company take into consideration projections from St. Louis County? St. Louis County North County is expecting a major, safari land kind of attraction to our area. And there's lots of construction, reconstruction. Highways have been reconfigured from not only on our side, but from the Illinois side of the river.
Yep.
And some other projections regarding some developments down on that riverfront. Did you consider, or did you talk to anyone from St. Louis County regarding future developments in this area, or was your conversations primarily targeted toward the municipalities that the district serves?
No, so the way that we actually start out this process is by building a population forecast at a higher level of geography, which would be the county, right? And then we basically parcel out growth or decline throughout the county by the school districts. And we do that both looking at development as well as historical trends. So the historical trends would be those population estimates that I showed. And then we're basically
Right.
trying to take into account changes in the share of the county's population forecast based on development. So those kind of development pieces were brought into that. And then that population projection model is used to calibrate our enrollment forecasts. So the answer would be yes. I am always open to, more information on those pieces. And, like I said at the start of this process, these are incredibly useful planning tools only if they're questioned. And so I think these are the right kind of discussions to be having. But given all of the data that we've brought into this, I was looking a lot at actual building permits and plan developments throughout the county is really what I was looking at.
When you began speaking at your presentation, you said decline in the county overall. Are you saying that you see an overall decline in North County, or are you specifically speaking only to Riverview?
No, I am specifically speaking to your part of the county. I'd have to go back and look at my numbers to say the rest.
Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any other questions? Ms. Fitzroy, do you have any questions?
So my other question, I'm sorry. Can you hear me, President?
Yes, Ms. Lane, we hear you. Ms. Titsworth has started speaking. Do you mind holding your question for a moment, please?
Yes, I don't know. I don't mind at all. I didn't hear her.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Titsworth.
When you speak of industrial development, are you saying like tearing down houses and putting businesses there, urban leagues and all that?
So what I'm looking at is what the county and the municipalities have out there for development plans. I'm not proposing any developments, I
Oh,
guess is what
okay.
I'm saying. I'm saying I'm looking at what they are proposing. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but it
Yeah.
sounds like what you're saying in 10 years is in 10 years, you're gonna move some of the homeowners out or what have you and build. So the number of children that's in school, the loss that we will have is because of your
No, the
industries.
no, some of the loss that we're seeing is a continuation of trends that we've seen, a decrease in the school age population over the past 10 years. So it's continuing some of that trend. Some of that trend of decrease is mitigated by the fact that there's actually proposed development coming in that would bring potentially more people in. But it's not, what I'm saying is there are other economic and other just demographic forces that are impacting migration that, from our kind of professional experience would say that is going to continue, but some of that is going to be mitigated by some of this development, which may bring in potential school age children. Does that make sense?
So in other words, you're saying it would be worse if those.
Yes.
We would see a larger decline
Yes.
in population or
Yep.
school age population if
Yep.
those particular developments weren't already occurring.
Yeah, because what we're trying to bake into this is the fact that we do see some economic development occurring. And therefore we would expect some of that decline to be less than it had been. So we're still seeing a declining population, but it is declining slower than it has in the past.
And when you say a declining population, you're referring to school
School age
age.
children, school
Okay,
age
so
children.
that could be
Yep.
that our population is aging
Yep,
and that the students
Yep.
or there's not a younger population here to,
again, there are less births in general
right.
in the United
Mhm.
States.
Yeah.
So it's not, not just here, like there are just less children
Okay,
being born, unless you bring in a large immigrant. That's really the other
a
piece.
larger
Immigrant. community.
immigrant.
Yep.
Is it like the city where they bought out the houses for, what is that, NGA and all that, and the population was less for the school district?
So again, kind of what we're bringing to bear here is not necessarily, we're not saying there are going to be these many houses, these many less houses, and therefore we're going to have less children. It's more of historically, we've seen net migration out of the school district. We think that is going to continue based on prevailing economic and demographic factors. However, we're mitigating some of that based on potential new residential development that would come along with some of the industrial and as well as commercial development, right? Industrial commercial development should bring some housing, some people to work those jobs. So we would assume there would be some either residential development or repopulating of vacant homes. And so that's kind of the thinking through all of this. So there is nowhere in our model that we're saying, these houses are going away and therefore we're losing people. It's more of a historical patterns of migration show us that we've been losing people for 10 years. To really simplify it, we're going to continue that trend, but not quite as much because there is some economic development.
Ms. Lane, you had a question?
Yes, but it might be beyond the scope of this conversation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I said yes, but yes, I do. However, listening to everything, it may be outside the scope of this conversation. So I understand projections and all of that. So we're just, the data is very interesting. It's just interesting.
Are there any further questions?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Madam President, that concludes our items for discussion.
To I. No, here we go. And there's no further information, no further questions? This one, before adjournment, is that right? Is that where we are?
So my question is,
Yes, Ms. Lane.
so my question is, at another meeting or in another setting, are we going to discuss how this information is going to be implemented in our particular planning process?
Yes, ma'am. We have a series of meetings planned to address this issue. And so we will talk further about our plans and at those meetings.
Ms. Lane, did you hear Dr. Coleman's response?
Ms. Lane, could you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yes,
Ye-
so
Yes, ma'am.
yes, we will continue the discussion at the scheduled meetings that we have planned. And each meeting will will address specific areas. Did you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. I heard you. Yes, ma'am. I heard you.
Okay. If there be nothing further, making a motion to adjourn.
Madam Chair, I so move.
It's been motioned by Ms. Mara Real.
Second.
Second, any questions? Seeing no objection, meeting is adjourned.